Hello? Oh, hello, friends. Oh, why'd the computer crash? Because it had a bad driver. Hi, my name's Sean Sposito. I'm an analyst in fraud and security at Javelin Strategy and Research, and welcome to Enigma Interviews, our series of long-form conversations between folks both within the security community and within adjacent communities. Before I go any further, thank you guys all for being here. Could you guys give yourselves a round of applause? We're really excited. We work really hard on this. So let's get pumped up. Let's get up. But before we go any further, I think it's important to say that we're trying to keep this conversation to about 50 minutes to an hour. This is being live streamed, so folks at home, thank you so much for tuning in. The hashtag is Enigma INTVW. Most importantly, throughout the next hour or so, it's really important for you guys to ask questions. You were all given seat cards. For folks in the audience, you were all given seat cards that you can write questions down, kind of throughout the conversation as they sort of occur to you, and I'll get those to our moderator. Folks will be coming along the side. Most importantly, thank you so much to our sponsors, New Context, The Parallax, Avast, and my employer, Javelin Strategy and Research, and most importantly, the 2018 Enigma board chairs, Brian Payne of Netflix and Franziska Rosner of the University of Washington. Can we give them a round of applause? There'll be a lot of applauding. And Brian, do you want to come up and talk a little bit about Enigma, which is just a few weeks away?
Thank you. All right, so how many of you have heard of this conference called Enigma? A few hands. Thank you. That's great. So I'm just here to give a quick plug for Enigma, maybe if you haven't heard of it or if you have and you just want to learn a little more. So Enigma, it's a security conference. This is obviously an event that sort of stems out of there. We really try to focus on inclusion and diversity and creating a safe place for talking about all sorts of interesting security topics. I think if you compare it to other security conferences, some of the things that distinguish it, you will find that the talks are sort of like TED Talks. They're very well-rehearsed, very high-quality talks. They tend to be very engaging and give you sort of things to think about in the years to come, as opposed to sort of like one little nugget takeaway. You'll be pondering these ideas for quite a long time. It's also really interesting because it's a good mix of academia, government, and industry that all show up. So you see all sorts of interesting people there, and you can really collaborate and get some fun ideas. So the conference this year has a really wonderful program. The program's already online, so you can go check out and see what the talks are going to be. As you've probably seen on these slides flipping through here, the conference will be in January, and registration is open, so I certainly encourage anyone who's interested in coming to attend. It's down in Santa Clara, so it's just maybe 50 or 60 miles south of here. So if you made it to this event, you can probably make it to that one as well. I think that's all that I have, so I'll hand it back over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. I appreciate you. So every year, globally, millions of people die in car accidents, and the specter of connected and autonomous vehicles kind of create the promise that won't be so in the future. But with this innovation comes new risks, both regulatory and security challenges. Here to discuss those challenges, it's my incredible honor to welcome Seth Rosenblatt. Seth is the editor of The Parallax, and please clap for Seth. He's really shy. Seth has been working in online journalism since 1999 and began covering security and privacy for CNET in 2007. You founded The Parallax in 2015. Stefan Savage. Stefan, please come. Stefan is a recent winner of the MacArthur Genius Grant Award. What is that like to be a genius? That's fantastic. Wicked. You are a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of California, San Diego, and your research interests lie at the intersection of computer security, distributed systems, and networking. And finally, Deirdre Mulligan. Please clap. Please clap. Please clap. Deirdre is an associate professor in the School of Information at UC Berkeley, and you were an associate professor at the school, and a faculty director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. So listen, thank you guys so much for coming again. I really appreciate you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Sean, for that intro. I want to start off with a very short story. A few years ago, when I was a reporter covering Google, I had the great fortune to go down to the Google campus and step inside of what looked like a Lexus that had some kind of War of the Worlds contraption stuck to the top of it. And two guys sat in the front of the car, and I was in the back. And the car drove itself down through the streets of Mountain View. And at one point, it came across a bicyclist who was in the bike lane, and the car made a decision to scoot over just a little bit more in its own lane. And I thought that was remarkable, that even back then, the cars were able to make those kind of judgments. And so I'm curious to hear from Stefan and Deirdre where we're at now with connected cars and autonomous cars, and what the differences are. A little bit of level setting.
Sure, I'll take that. So it is on. It says on. You know, us geniuses can figure on. Someone could fix the level. Connected is simply that your vehicle actually is going to interact through some wireless mechanism with other devices out on the road or with the infrastructure. And so pretty much if you bought a car in the last 4 or 5 years, it is a connected vehicle of some kind. And it may be that it's, part of the way it's connected is to your own personal devices, things like Bluetooth. It is internally connected to its various sensors. But then a lot of these things now have reach-back capability with telematics so that you can report that you have a crash and that first responders should be alerted that there's traffic upcoming. So that's, I think, what we typically mean when we say connected. We'll sometimes also talk about cars talking to one another in future collision avoidance scenarios, or for what's called convoying, where you have a set of trucks together trying to get better efficiency by being one right behind the other. That's separate from being autonomous.
And what do we mean by autonomous cars?
So autonomous means that you don't have to be driving them, that they will drive themselves. And the Society of Automotive Engineers has created a classification scheme from level 1 to level 5, and 1 is the car I have, which does nothing. And 2 is, it'll do some limited stuff, like tell you if you're going out of your lane, and 3 gives you partial. So this is like the Tesla autopilot. It will drive, but if it's not quite sure, it's going to say, no, put your hand on the wheel, I don't know what's going on. And then level 4 is in a limited set of circumstances on certain roads and so forth. It's complete autonomous driving. You don't need to do anything. You don't have to be prepared to do the switch. And then level 5 is, go to sleep in the back. It can do anything anywhere.
And how far are we from 5 at this point?
No one has anything that is close to 5. So, and I think it also depends on how often does it have to do that, right? So you can go. Everyone who drives test autonomous vehicles, for example, in the state of California, is required to register, and we have 40-some companies in the state of California who are testing such vehicles. And one of the things that they have to report is how often did the driver need to put their hand on the wheel, and how often did they need to do that for safety reasons. And so, for example, some of the longest running cars, which are the ones from Waymo, Google, they have it down to maybe between 0.1 and 0.2 events per 1,000 miles traveled. All right? So that is how often they're going around that someone needed to grab the wheel for a safety-related reason. Now, to put that in context, the fatality rate for the normal cars that you and I drive is 1 death per 100 million miles traveled. Right, so to be safer than our normal cars, with us driving them, we would have to get to a point where an accident that could cause a fatality is significantly less frequent than 1 out of 100 million miles traveled. And no one currently has a vehicle. No one has enough miles to even come close to showing that, right? Because total miles traveled by Google vehicles is maybe 3 million, 4 million, something like that.
And that's since 2007?
Yeah. So, you'd need 100 million if it was as good as a human driver, you'd need 100 million miles autonomously traveled to get 1 death, to say we're about the same. And then you'd have huge amounts of variation. So it's going to take a long time for us to feel confident that these things are safer. And we're still, these things, as I said, between 0.1 and 0.2 times per 1,000 miles, that it's not quite right.
And Deirdre, if you could tell us a little bit about what some of the broader security concerns are with autonomous cars and connected cars?
Sure. Leading off talking about security when I have Stefan here is perhaps odd. But because we were talking about connected cars, right? We now have cars that have lots of computation on board, but they also are opening themselves up either internally to the devices we have in the car or more and more to things like calling home, right? Being able to report information back home. And as with other Internet of Things sorts of devices, right, that new attack surface, particularly in industries where there hasn't been as much attention to cybersecurity, right, lots of attention to safety, but not necessarily the same level of expertise as we might see in some other industries where security and particularly motivated adversaries have been a more constant piece of the external landscape. We have some catching up to do, and Stefan has been, a leader in looking at some of the security risks of that increased kind of attack surface and how that changes the kinds of threat models that we see.
Actually, just to add something, just concretely, so people have a sense of this, there have been 3 publicly demonstrated complete remote takeover of connected car platforms. There was the group my group between UCSD and the University of Washington that did it on the GM OnStar platform in 2010. And then there was Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek on the Fiat Chrysler platform on the Jeep, which they did, I think, in 2015.
That's right.
And then just this last summer, there was a group out of China that did it on the Tesla. And these are remote, arbitrary distance, sight unseen, and do anything you want. Turn off the brakes, speed the car up, whatever. And so
never had physical access to the cars.
Zero physical access in advance or at the time. And so that is the systemic risk that you get from connectivity.
I mean, I think especially for consumers or people who aren't too familiar with connected cars, the idea that you can hack into a car remotely and disable it is terrifying. Certainly as a motorcyclist, that's the last thing I want to have to deal with. But who are the people, besides security researchers, who would be interested in hacking cars remotely in the first place?
So that is an interesting question.
Who was interested in hacking Facebook?
Yeah.
Is hacking Facebook the same as hacking a car?
No.
In terms of adversaries?
So there's a long discussion, though, because there's a lot of different motivations one might have. So right now, I'll tell you who's doing it, is car thieves. Right? We have made immobilization technology sufficiently advanced that if you want to steal a luxury vehicle, this thing you see in the movies where you go under the dash and twist some wires together and you hotwire it, that does not work. So the only way you're going to steal one of those cars today is you have a little dongle that you're going to shove in the OBD2 port underneath the driver's side, and you can buy them in Russia or Mexico online, and that will basically hack in and disable the immobilizer so you can steal the car. And so they're doing it because there's a financial incentive. Now you might ask, who would have an incentive to do things that are not financially motivated? Well, it depends. I think I'm not a big believer in kind of the bombastic assassination by car. I don't think that's a cost-effective way. But look, if you ask me what is the most reasonable scenario in which this gets used in anger, it's some group, let's pick Anonymous, for example, thinks it'd be really funny to take all of the BMWs and Lexuses in San Francisco and brick them so they don't start. And they, I think, would think it was really funny. And the barrier to doing that has been going down over time because more knowledge is out there. A bunch of the people who work in this space have released their code and documentation, so there's less that you need to learn from scratch. And frankly, breaking something requires much less knowledge than making it do something. So I can totally envision someone as a form of cyber protest just destroying a bunch of cars. And then you have scenarios where if you have someone who's very high value, it becomes interesting.
Sure. So who currently leads on securing cars?
So neither of us make cars. Right. All right. So yeah.
And I also, without being inside, like, security is both, there are certain things that I think as a researcher, Stefan is able to look at, and then there's also kind of the processes around security, and those are often really hard. When you think about, a product, you can think about it as a search good, right? Like, what can you assess from the outside? I can see the color of the car, I can understand a whole bunch of things that allow me to know that I want this car. Security is really hard to assess, even as an experience good, right? That you can have a piece of software and it never gets hacked, and so you may believe that it's secure, but lo and behold, it may have a vulnerability in there that just hasn't yet been exploited or whatever. And even as an expert, it can be really hard to understand. And I think it would be great to hear Stefan talk about some of the kind of investment that has to be made in actually understanding some of the vulnerabilities in software, or in some instances, like the VW emissions scandal, actually looking at active efforts to use code to cloak misbehavior, because I think that's super important here too.
Sure. Do you want to take
Yeah, sure. So let me talk about the first one first. It's hard to know, what everyone is doing. I will say that General Motors, who I know fairly well because we picked their car to go after, and after their board saw fit not to sue us, they decided to actually put a bunch of money in. And so I have followed fairly closely the kinds of things they've done from both a process standpoint and a technology standpoint. And I think they actually, in a strange sense, lucked out because we did our experiments with them first. Mm-hmm. And so they got the fear early and put the investment in early. And so if you were to ask me for low level, just car security, they are, I think, doing much better than most of the other mainstream car companies because they've had a long time to put a lot of resources into it, and they've taken it seriously. Mm-hmm. They have a product CISO with 100 people under him, and they're redoing bunches of the architecture, how they assess code, how they sign things. I would say that other companies maybe have come to it a little bit later, and that's why some of them have been able to be attacked the way they were. I think the other, there's another both advantage and disadvantage that some of the newer companies have, companies like Tesla, which is because a greater fraction of the car are their own assemblies where they wrote their own software. It can have a kind of a unified design process. One challenge most car manufacturers have is that they don't write the code. Mm-hmm. They don't, and it's not that any other singular entity writes the code. There are like 100 different companies that write the code that then all gets integrated. And the car company doesn't have that code. It's not their code. They have a bunch of boxes that they try to get to work together through testing, but they have 20 different microprocessors and 15 different operating systems, and year to year it may change. I mean, it is a little bit of a nightmare from an assessment standpoint. And so a company like Tesla, since fewer parts of the car are procured that way, has a structural advantage in being able to say, all right, we're going to engineer all of the code this particular way. Now, they have a disadvantage that they're newer, and so you have startup pangs and so forth.
It sounds like a lot of what you're describing that's happening with cars right now is happening in a microcosm of what's happening in software in general, issues with securing software that's been made elsewhere and being used in a device that it may not actually be intended to be used for, or maybe not in the precise way that it was intended. And how do you, there's problems securing that kind of code not in cars, in web browsers. But with cars, it's so much more serious. These are vehicles hurtling down the road at 40, 70 miles an hour. How do we know when the code in a car is going to be safe? If a browser crashes, it doesn't matter. And if a car crashes, it's a big deal.
We don't. We don't know. And I think Deirdre's point is an interesting one too, which is that in a number of cases, you have to vie with the issue that there are incentives that the car manufacturer has to make code that passes whatever regulatory hurdle there is. And she and her colleagues have found issues in voting machines where they have a test mode, and with these emissions scandals with Volkswagen and other things, there similarly was code. The code is incredibly malleable and very hard to analyze. And there is no regulatory body who either has the purview to go and do that or the ability. Right? If I wanted to take your car and find a part of the government, say, please go and analyze it all to make sure it's safe, we do not have that expertise that they could actually do that.
And it is really interesting to think about the voting context, right? So there was obviously a lot of attention to voting machines again after the last election, and I got to participate with some other computer scientists who worked on the security, accuracy, reliability of electronic voting systems. And it was another instance where you had state entities, federal entities that were issuing standards, that were responsible for procurement, who didn't have technical expertise, who didn't have access to the things that the code, or in the context of voting, they were limited in the sort of testing they could do, the certification processes were closed. And so you have regulators that are trying to assess whether or not something is fit for purpose, right? Whether it's fit to support our democratic processes or fit to be on the road, that don't have the internal capacity to do the sort of assessments necessary. And as things are getting more and more complex, there's not a requirement that you go and, for example, hand over your code, right, and say, here it is, look at it before we roll it into the car or before we issue an update. Any of those things, right? That there are federal motor vehicle safety standards at the federal level, and that to the extent that there is a software issue that goes to safety, right? You could imagine a recall happening, and we've seen that. But the limited capacity of the regulators, given the fact that they don't have many people like Stefan on staff, is really a problem as we build computation and connectivity into more and more of these safety critical or democracy critical systems.
Is the world ready for this nuance?
We
have a choice?
I don't think we have a choice. I mean, I think, so there's another alternative, right, which is what we do for aviation, because one of the things we also study is aviation. When you build avionics equipment, same effective issue as you have in a car. It's controlling, the flaps and so on and so forth. We have a certification standard, DO-178B, and FAA has people on site, and the code gets certified. It will take years to go and make significant changes to a piece of software, but it gets signed off on before it ever gets put on a plane, and any change has to be signed off on by whereas if you look at what we do with automobiles, we do have these federal motor vehicle safety standards, but then they're written, and then each manufacturer self-certifies. They say, we are in compliance. And it is there is a limited amount of testing that goes on to figure out if it's not true. And so every now and then you'll find out that EPA will do that for gas mileage, or you'll find some safety issue, usually because of reports of problems. But there's not a sign-off that you do to say the thing is safe, because it would make new car releases be like new plane releases, right, every 10 years. And so that is not something that the public has agreed that they care enough about to do. And I don't think we will do that.
So what does trusting an autonomous car look like?
So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think we've talked a lot about connected, and so one part of the security puzzle has nothing to do with autonomous, and that's the connected part. That is, are there bugs in the code, just like you can have bugs in your browser, so an external party could take advantage of them and take over the car. And you don't need an autonomous car to worry about that. You can worry about that with the car you have. Autonomous brings in some interesting new attack surface domains. One is at the sensor level, because they have to interpret the world around them, because they have to know that that sign says that they should stop, and they have to know that this is the edge of the lane, and that that's a bicycle. And we're using a variety of different sensor technologies to do that, by and large driven by machine learning on the back end inside the vehicle. one of the challenges we have is people spoofing the images in ways that are adversarial with respect to the machine learning algorithm. So there's a group out of Michigan and Berkeley and Washington that recently demonstrated that they could create graffiti on signs that would make a vision-based classifier, which is only one of the sensors you would use, think that a stop sign actually was a speed limit sign and get them to interpret it in a different way. You may have seen this thing online with the people demonstrating that the turtle gets interpreted by the Google Vision thing as a rifle. Yeah. So that kind of thing, but now that's the input that the car is using to understand the world. And we do not understand very much about adversarial learning. Then there are also concrete attacks against like LiDAR sensors, bounce light, and so there have been people who have demonstrated, okay, well I can go and send in a beam at the same frequency out of phase to make it think that in fact an object is closer or further away than it actually is, and there have been some demonstrated attacks there. So there's a lot of ongoing work as the community is just kind of sussing out what are the sensor vulnerabilities. And then the other part of the attack surface is different is the decision-making vulnerabilities, because you have this device that's taking all this sensory input and then is going to decide what to do. And if it sees an obstacle, it's going to go left or right or slow down or brake. And that stuff is, we don't know what those rules are, and we don't know what they break down into. I guarantee you there are going to be groups who take that stuff apart and say, and when I trace through all the various decision logic, an interesting thing comes out. If they suddenly had to brake left and the road is slippery and then they see a such and such sign, it's going to speed up because no one thought about that, or that there's a mistake somewhere in the code.
And Deirdre, we saw this with the Tesla crash recently, right? Or wasn't too recently, but...
Not too recently. I mean, the Tesla crash, I'd love to hear Stefan's perspective on it too, but for me as a layperson, right, or talking to lay people, or my mother's reaction was like, I thought the car could see, right? Like it drove into the side of a truck. I thought it could see, right? And when we think about autonomous vehicles, one of the things that they're doing is they're observing our behavior, they're watching our patterns, they're collecting lots of data, they're learning about us. But what we see people focusing on much more now, not just with autonomous vehicles, but generally with machine learning systems, is that humans who are relying on these things need to understand the assumptions and limits of the models. Otherwise, we get into all sorts of trouble, right? And if you understand that the way the car, quote unquote, sees is based on this array of sensors that don't perfectly match up to the way in which you see. So it may recognize things that you don't and be able to respond more quickly than you can in certain circumstances. But there may be some particular failure modes that you might want to be really acutely aware of if you want to kind of safely hand off responsibility with your third-tier autonomous vehicle.
And this is a place where I think maybe we do disagree, because I think all of the evidence on this has been that the handoff capability is a disaster. And so if you go back and look at all of the evidence from aviation, where we now have increasing levels of autopilot, the lack of situational awareness has meant for pilots that when things are wrong and they suddenly have to take over, they are incapable of dealing with what's going on because they don't actually know what the state of the system is. And so most of the car companies, perhaps Tesla accepted, is skipping level 3, because the trade-off, when you talk to the engineers, they will say it is so much easier to build a self-driving car than to build a car that drives with a human some of the time. Because now you need to understand what the human understands, and in fact, they believe that you're taking care of it, and all of a sudden you're not, and you're in deep trouble.
So I don't know that we disagree so much as I think that is partially where we are right now, right? Is that humans are relying on like the Tesla, and I've heard other stories of people driving and having accidents, and they're relying on the car to do things that they've been warned and told they should not be relying upon it to do. And the engagement that the design of the cars is trying to generate from the human is failing, right?
And in fact, I think the way it gets used is at a certain level, it's an escape. We actually don't know what to do, so just you beep, and then you say, well, it's not my problem. But the reality is, look, incredibly well-respected researchers. I mean, some incredibly well-known people, if I respected my entire life, have Teslas and tell me these stories about how they put weights on the wheel for drives from Southern California to Northern California because they want to be able to lie down, and it's just nuts. All right? And these are really well-educated people. These are technically
Are they wearing crash helmets?
super savvy people.
Armored suits?
And so I think that this notion that you can expect that people are going to be able to take over is wrong.
But it is kind of where we're living right now, and you know, Stefan mentioned the disengagement reports, right? And so anybody who's testing an autonomous fleet in California, one of the things that you have to do, in addition to having certain kinds of people who've been trained to be in those vehicles, not driving them, right? Is file these disengagement reports that explain the conditions under which, and in particular, the sorts of things that caused the car to basically, I don't like to think of it as a handoff, as a throwback, like, okay, it's your job right now. Right. And some of those are super interesting reading because, as Stefan said, they've found in aviation, you'll have an example like this where the car is driving along and there's a green light. However, the car senses that there's a vehicle coming perpendicular to it that doesn't seem to be slowing down despite the fact that they have the right-of-way, and the car starts to slow down, and the person seizes control and speeds up and gets T'd, right? And so the question of like situational awareness, and sometimes that handoff point, the interaction between the human and the machine learning system, the autonomous system, is the point of absolute fallibility.
And there's this interesting thing that most people, when people think about autonomous driving, they think of it as an algorithmic problem. Well, I get this input and I stay on the road or not. But there's a social component to driving that we don't account for that actually creates a bunch of challenges. So you will read all of these reports where the car will stop and there'll be a pedestrian, and the pedestrian will say, we'll do this, and the car does not know what this is. That is not something they have been programmed to deal with. Or there's eye contact from the other driver, and they say, go ahead, and nothing happens. And similarly, after there's a crash, there's first responders will come and direct traffic, and there's all these ways that we actually are interacting with other people in doing this, and they're not necessarily prepared to deal with cars, not autonomous cars. And then I've heard, and I have no personal experience, but I've heard from people that, particularly in the Bay Area, that some people have had to make their autonomous cars more aggressive because there are people who see the autonomous cars and are angry because of, whatever, the price of real estate out here. And they know the car is going to be conservative, and so they just kind of edge it off the side of the road, and it will go off the side of the road. And you can get in front of it and stop, and it'll stop short. And you know that you will always win. You can take out your aggression against a robotic car because it will always stay safe. They're never going to get out and beat you up or anything like that. And you laugh, but I guarantee you that a lot of these things, whether it's the pranks with the graffiti or just slowing down next to it, that people are going to do this as a form of social complaint. And if certainly, if teenagers could make a bunch of the cars just stop, they will do it because it will be funny.
Before we get too far away from the level 3 discussion, I'm just curious, is there anybody besides Tesla that's exploring sort of the level 3 situation?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, look, there's so many companies in this space. There are 200 companies. So I'm sure there is someone. But I'd actually like to highlight the other side, which is if you look, for example, what Ford has done. Their model has been, okay, we're going to try to deploy a self-driving car soon, but we understand that there are a lot of issues. We're going to shoot for level 4, and we're not going to sell to consumers. So their model entirely is that they're going to sell fleets to a town or a small city. They're going to regularly send by their cars that are going to do these LiDAR measurements of everything down to a centimeter. That gives them an up-to-date model of everything that is there. If anything, so that they control everyone, they get to update everyone, they get to maintain everyone. If the conditions are bad and it's not working well, they can send out drivers because the entire thing is an on-demand fleet service. And so this is their way, they're hedging some of the safety unknowns, which is to say, we'll control the entire thing and we'll monitor the entire thing, and we have fallback provisions in place if it's not working right, but we're going to offer it as a service in very limited fashion because we don't feel comfortable that we think we can field a car that can handle anything, anytime, anywhere.
One of the things that I find really interesting in this discussion is the issue of who's responsible, especially because the history of software is that software companies are generally not responsible for their products. And car companies generally have been, and they've been subject to recalls. And we saw after the Wired story that there was that big recall. And I'm fascinated and curious and a little scared to think about what's going to happen as development of autonomous cars proceeds. Where are we in sort of figuring out where car maker and car software maker and driver liability should be?
So the question about, when we think about software on your computer, right, we know that it often always comes with some sort of terms of use that basically limits the liability for damage that might happen, and that has created some perhaps disincentives to address some of the security concerns and other reliability issues, et cetera. And it's software as a service, not so much as a product, right? Now, when we think about cars, those are things that we buy as consumers as products, and so the product liability rules are different, right? And so the question about where driver error and car error are going to come into play, there are a set of concerns, and particularly when we have these kind of complicated issues it's not clear that the car is fully in control or the humans fully in control, and things are kind of passing back and forth. That's the area where things are going to be kind of the grayest, and there'll be lots of data collection and analysis, and one of the issues is going to be what sort of data is being collected about who was controlling what during which situations. But with respect to product liability, I mean, there'll be design defects and manufacturing defects, and also defects of the kind of information that's provided for consumers about safe use, right? And if we think about making sure that consumers understand the conditions under which they should be using the vehicle and in certain kinds of modes. Now, as Stefan said, is that going to keep people the safest? I think that there's a lot to learn from aviation, that no, those kind of handoffs back and forth are often the places where we find the most safety risks, and so that's probably not the sweet spot. But the liability issues, I think, our product liability and tort liability will address these issues. The question of how liability gets allocated behind the scenes, right, between the car manufacturer and, as Stefan was talking about, all the various component parts, that'll be something that gets sorted out through contract and other sorts of issues, I think, among the car manufacturers with all of their suppliers, and it will range.
But just to add, this assumes that we work under kind of the existing statutory framework. Yes. There is certainly a move afoot, particularly given the current administration, to consider tort reform around this space the same way we have for aviation and nuclear power plants, which is to carve out a safe haven relative to this particular category, with the idea being to encourage deployment of autonomous vehicles by reducing the liability risk of fielding one of those. Remains to be seen what happens there.
Are either of you in favor of that?
So, if you take aviation, right, that the different liability rules are also premised on lots of different sorts of oversight and testing and review, and so, it's hard to say what one would be for or against without viewing a kind of comprehensive scheme. And, just when we're thinking about the safety improvements that we might see from level 4 or level 5 autonomous vehicles, which I think everybody assumes, right, would materialize because drivers, cars are not going to be drunk. Cars are not going to have road rage, as Stefan said, right? There are certain sorts of things that humans are prone to that machines won't be. However, it's not, I think we actually need data that a lot of the cars that are being tested today only operate under certain conditions, right? They say, well, our vehicles only are on the roads when they're dry, or they're only on the roads during daylight hours, or they're not on the roads in certain sorts of conditions, which means that we don't actually have a fair comparison of data yet, right? And so, but if you imagine an environment where you have a lot of data, right, and we know that cars are going to be safe under these sets of conditions in autonomous mode, and that it actually is going to reduce traffic fatalities, and we have confidence in the code that's being deployed in those systems, and we understand that cars are going to interact with each other in successful ways. Like, we haven't even talked about the fact that when we think about autonomous vehicles operating in mixed systems with humans that might be acting antagonistically, pedestrians that are unpredictable, like there's a lot of parameters there, right? But I think one could imagine an environment where we say, well, there's a huge public safety benefit here, and we might want to shift to a system that promotes this in a way that does something to spread liability in different ways. But under the current administration, I actually can't see that sort of conversation emerging, because there's not a deep desire to create new regulations or new oversight. If anything, there's a, if you pass one, you got to take two away mentality. And so it's hard to imagine it in this current environment.
Any thoughts on regulation and reform?
So yeah, the current Department of Transportation, I think, is more hands-off on this, and their guidance thus far has been voluntary safety assessments by the manufacturers, and encouraging states to be very expansive in what regulations they put out. So I think they are in a mode where they are interested in encouraging as much innovation as possible, and so they have turned that knob up to 11. And I think where things will go back is when we have adverse events, right? When bad things happen, that will create the political will. But we're not gonna have any significant regulatory oversight for autonomous vehicles in the short term.
Yeah, and I think it is super interesting to look at. So the automated vehicle policy that came out under the Obama administration, in coordination between the White House and the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, was super interesting in a bunch of respects. One, it was talking about extending some of their regulatory capacity, bringing greater kind of collaboration with outside experts so that they could beef up their security and cybersecurity expertise. They also, for the first time, at least that I've ever seen, they said they wanted to have an open public participatory process to basically look at the ethical frameworks that were going to be embedded in the machine learning algorithms in autonomous vehicles. And we don't see any of that sort of kind of public-facing, public engagement. It's become much more of a, we're going to rely on the private sector, and we're going to let them make decisions about whether or not they're even going to disclose their safety assessments to the public.
Now, one thing to remember is that this is a worldwide market, and so the United States is not the only place that is going to assert conditions that are going to drive how this goes. So on this issue of ethics, the German Ministry of Transportation, I believe, was recently basically convened a committee to come up with a set of ethical guidelines, and are quite in depth for autonomous vehicles about all the things that they can and can't do. And among the things that was interesting was they basically said that there is no way to encode moral choices in a piece of code in a way that is defensible.
So, but what if the code makes what we would consider to be a moral or ethical error in judgment, where, say, between, killing me and a deer, it chooses me? Like, honestly, like...
And actually, that is one that
I'd like the deer to go away.
That is one of the ones that they call out explicitly, that that you are preferences between all things and people you have to make. So you have to kill the animal. I mean, they called that out. There's even a section on this over the person. Now, the challenge where it comes in is when you start saying things like, well, over there, it's 2 old people, and there is 1 young person. Right? So which one am I going to, what's the quality of those individuals? And they specifically said, you can't make those judgments.
I mean, that's the Philippa Foot trolley problem, right? You've got 5 people on one line who are going to be killed, 1 person on another who will be killed only if you choose to send the trolley over there. But saying that you're not going to make that decision doesn't, I mean, how does that work with a car that's coming at you?
That is a great question. I think what they mean by that is you cannot codify it. You cannot say in code, here is our policy is that we kill the old people. And here is the object, the old people killer object that gets called in that situation. That is not an okay thing under this German policy. Now, you're right, the car has to go somewhere. I think, look, the challenge is that when we understand that drivers are going to make choices that are both moral choices and legal choices, and we understand how to hold drivers accountable, and those moral choices and legal choices may be at odds with one another. We spend a lot of time wringing our hands post hoc looking at it. This is why we have a court system. This is why we have jurisprudence. We then go back, and some people may suffer for things they didn't do on purpose. We have no way to say, you know, that tail recursive algorithm needs to go to jail for 3 years because it was not well designed. I mean, it's incompatible with how we can't, they're not people. And so I think we're at a loss to we're not comfortable, I think, saying that this is something that we should codify in that manner.
Sure. And for you, Deirdre, I'm curious because you've done so much research into other areas of IoT, voting machines and so on. What can the autonomous car and connected car developers learn from other areas of IoT, mistakes that have been made or advances that have been made that may help inform decisions with cars?
I hate to do this, but I want to actually talk more about what Stefan
Sure,
was
we
just
can come back to that one. That's fine.
People like to talk about the kind of ethics of algorithms, and there's lots of debates across, you know, whether it's risk recidivism scores or redistricting, right? All these questions about what are the biases that are being baked into them. And when we think about the biases, you know, the VW admission, there's like an intentional effort to use the plasticity of code to build in something that is trying to defeat a public choice about how cars ought to behave. You can also think, right, so Stefan was talking about the way in which the external environment might be manipulated in ways that game an algorithmic system so that it's making choices that are inconsistent with the ones that we had wanted it to make, right? So it's misunderstanding the external environment and thinking that a stop sign is actually a speed limit sign, right? That's another way in which we can have bias. It's about the data that's coming into the system. And then, you know, we often think about the biases that can develop from the developer's perspectives, right? And part of those can be just myopia, right? That we all come with our own priors and our own assumptions about what it means to lead a good life. And if we're not actually debating what the good life ought to be, it's going to be left up to individual software engineers or car manufacturers or whatever to make decisions about how cars behave. And so for me, I actually think one of the opportunities that we have is we often, right, so when you're driving down the road and all of a sudden something runs out in front of you, it's a child, it's a deer, you pick, that you behave in that split second in a way that you might be really happy with later on, or that you might be crushed, right? And one of the things that machine learning or other sorts of autonomous systems present the opportunity to do is actually to think about those decisions from a point of reflection, right? And a point of public deliberation rather than private action, right? And we all know that you can talk to people about what their preferences are, and then you can observe their behavior. And sometimes those things don't fully align, right? And part of it is that in the moment, we may not have the time to actually do what we actually thought was the optimal thing because it's a crisis. But it also may be because we suffer from a whole host of cognitive deficits or biases that influence our perspective in the moment, right? And so while you can be like very sympathetic to the desire that's expressed by the committee in Germany not to make choices, certainly to prefer certain kinds of human life, we have to reckon with the fact that the machine learning algorithms are going to be making decisions, and they're going to have to interact collectively, right? It's not one autonomous vehicle, it's a whole bunch of them. And if they all have their own reasoning, that's going to really mess things up in a catastrophic way. And so I think there's an opportunity to actually have public conversations about what are the right outcomes. And we often want to avoid those conversations. We just want to leave it all to individuals making choices in the moment. And depending upon how things play out, one could actually view this as an opportunity for a different kind of moral engagement.
But so this actually reminds me, there was this study that got done recently, I think out of Davis, where they went and they interviewed a bunch of people about these questions. And by and large, 70-some% of the people preferred the notion of these autonomous cars that would, for example, kill the passenger in preference to killing like 20 other people on the street. But none of them wanted to drive that car. Right. And they all wanted their autonomous car to prefer their life to that of everyone else. And so, I mean, one of the challenges with having these discussions is they are very different in the abstract than when you are having to.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me as a similarity between the development of software and the development of cars previous to being computerized is that changes generally don't happen until there is disaster, until something bad happens. We didn't see laws against drunk driving, strict ones, until after MAD came into existence and was successful in pushing for those. And that led to the creation of all these safety features that had never really been considered by automakers or had been resisted by automakers. And similar with software, we saw Microsoft had to be, dragged kicking and screaming into an era where they actually cared about security. Now they're arguably quite good at it, but that took a long time to get there. And with self-driving cars, it worries me that we're going to not get to a place where they're really safe for people until people die. Do you think that that's inevitable?
So I think it's somewhat interesting, right? Stefan was talking about Ford's approach, right, which operating it as a service so they can maintain a lot of control over it, very detailed understanding of the physical environment in which the vehicles are going to be operating. And Tesla, for example, right, which doesn't come out of the automotive culture, but comes out of more of a software culture, right? And I think that because the potential, whether it's a security vulnerability or some other mistake, right, that might impact a car's functioning in a way that imperils safety, leads to physical harm that I think, whether it's in the automotive space or we look at medical devices, there are areas where while they might not have been thinking about the security vulnerabilities and the way in which computation and connectivity were changing their threat models, I think that they do have a different kind of incentive to pay attention because of, you have bodies at stake, not just data. And there's a real difference when we're talking about loss of information and how people feel about that and, death, injury, medical, poor outcomes. And so I think that there are ways in which the failure modes of the different industries really affect their postures. But I do think that the security issues, because there is a lack of deep expertise, there's been very spotty and uneven learning curve.
I think there's also, this is not unique to automobiles, but security technology gets monetized really only by two forces, right? One is bad guys, right? If someone is actually attacking you, then you need to invest in the security technology to stop that bad thing from happening. Absent that, there's not an economic need for you to invest to keep the pink elephants away. And this is a challenge that the automotive space had for a very long time, is no one's attacking cars. And that's why the quality of the security inside that code was just atrocious at the time we got into it. The other big force that creates value in the security industry is regulatory burden. All right, where you come in and say someone is going to slap you with a huge fine, you're not going to be allowed access to this market, what have you. And we do not currently have that either. And so I do not doubt that all of the car companies are interested in security and cybersecurity for their vehicles. I think they vary how seriously they take it based on how close to an existential event they've had. But by and large, absent something that shows up on the books as a cost, you can only afford a certain level of investment. I mean, this is a challenge. Imagine you are running a company. How much of your budget should you put into securing this, given that we have no actuarial data about how much you need, right? So should it be 5% of your budget, 10% of your budget? And these things end up being informed by cost. So like when we did our work, GM had to deal with this question. How much should they invest? And they ended up coming up with a model based on the loss of market share that Toyota had from the unintended acceleration debacle and how much it would cost in marketing to get that back. Once Charlie and Chris did their thing on the Jeep and there was a recall, now it sets a different cost structure, right? Because we have the rule of thumb is about $250 per car in a recall, and so now this thing was, whatever, $1/3 billion charge. But those are the things that end up driving the investment. And this is true of every technology. Until a technology becomes commodified, the interest in investing in security is secondary because you are trying to establish a new market. Everyone is running fast. No one knows what innovative feature is the thing that is going to allow them to get the market share before whoever goes first takes over this entire thing. And so security is not going to be the front burner question because nothing forces it to be.
I mean, one of the things that I think really stands out is that, especially in America, but around the world, there's been a nearly 100-year, more than 100-year history of developing car culture. And I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on how this entrenched car culture is going to interact with widespread autonomous vehicles, if at all. I mean,
well, so look, one issue, so one of the dreams around autonomous was that you are going to basically transform how car ownership works, that it's not going to be individually owned. You have fleets. It's basically, Uber and Lyft becomes a way of life, and you just call for a car when you need it, and that requires us to have less cars and less pollution and so on and so forth. That works fine in the urban core. Potentially works fine. It may not work as well. It'll work much better with younger generations who have grown up with it than older generations. But it is not going to work in rural America, which is a big chunk of the country. Right? There's just the economics don't work. All right, so you're already going to have this disparate, notion of is a car a service or is a car a product, and that's going to vary. But then you're right. There's a class of Americans who, if you tell them, no, you don't get to drive anymore, they're going to say, as if, right? I like Mustangs, right? I mean, that is...
An autonomous Mustang sounds horrible.
It does. It ruins the entire, whatever you got out of driving a Mustang. It was not that it was autonomous. And so I think that I think there's a generational aspect to this. And this is, in fact, part of the reason you get into the connected car to begin with, because the current young people are actually not buying cars, which is the thing that has freaked the auto industry out, which is why you start adding all of these e-features in the hope that you can bring that market back to the automobile, because otherwise you're in deep trouble.
But along with generational, I mean, I would love for there to be more widespread autonomous vehicles, because I don't want my parents driving in 5 or 10 years. That would be terrible. And I know, and one of my friends, in fact, I'm
sure they feel that way.
Yeah, my mom is in the audience tonight. But I think she agrees. And in fact, one of my friends, his parents, his dad is unable to drive, and he had to figure out how to. And they live in Mill Valley. He had to figure out how to get a lift to come to the house, pick him up, take him to the hospital, have his dad come back out after his appointment, and get another lift and get him home safely. And all of that had to happen without him being at the house or the hospital. And I think the idea that like these services can become a thing that will impact on people even outside of urban areas is one that will be cross-generational.
No, they absolutely can. It's a totally different cost structure, right? So that is a premium service where you're going to bring a car out. It's not that you had one, not that you had 6 nearby, right? That were out by your farm.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
not what's going on. But this is one of the many promises that autonomy provides, is that there's, people don't need to be able to drive. They can drive in conditions they wouldn't safely be able to drive in. They can do it when they're sick or injured. And in fact, it's not clear, frankly, what licensing means in this era. Like, why shouldn't a 6-year-old be allowed to take an autonomous car somewhere with their parents' permission? They don't have to drive it.
Right.
Yeah, the autonomous vehicles might open up a whole level of independence for people who haven't been able to have great access to mobility because of where they live, the lack of services, et cetera. I mean, there's still a cost barrier, right? And I think we'll see some haves and have-nots around that, and that'll partially be about where they're deployed, and that might not be rural areas, but also just about whether or not people have the money to pay for it. I was laughing because, while I don't view myself as car culture, the only cars we own are stick shift. And there's a Morgan and a P1800 Volvo, nice. And I'm one of those people who does it. I look at a Tesla and I say, why would I want that? I like to drive, right? And I'm certain that people like me are going to be paying a premium for the privilege of driving at some point in the future, because it's going to be riskier, particularly in the kind of old cars we like to drive.
And not as efficient. I mean, it's very hard, I will say, having gone shopping for a car recently, to find stick shifts anymore.
Oh, yeah.
We have 2 stick shift station wagons. Try finding those.
So I'm actually glad that you said that you recently had to go shopping for a car. I'm curious. One, what did you get? But I also want to hear from both of you. If you had to get something close to an autonomous vehicle that's available now, what would you get if presuming the cost of a high-end Tesla or whatever is out there wasn't an issue?
Well, I don't think that there are a lot of retail vehicles that are offering...
even semi-autonomy?
So things where they tell you about lane assistance, everyone's got this stuff. How good it is, I actually don't know. I mean, that's a great question, like whose early collision avoidance is better than someone else's. And I don't have the answer to that. I think that's going to make it for a very interesting Consumer Reports issue at some point, where they try to crash all these cars into things. But I'm not, aside from Tesla and, maybe there was that Audi, which was making some claims of level 2+. There's not a lot on the road today that you can buy as a customer that'll do this. By and large, these are all test fleets. And I mean, that's, again, I would like to stress, this is not a thing that is like ready for prime time tomorrow, as much as everyone would like it to be. There's a reason why you can't buy it at retail, and that's because someone is grabbing the wheel,
sure.
Every 0.2 times out of 1,000 miles, and they don't want you to die when they sell you the car.
Sure. I mean, we've seen. I think it was last week there was a story on road trains and Tesla's plans or desires to get semi-autonomous or fully autonomous trucks out on the road, so that they could save on fuel, save on cost of having a driver, and so on. And then that those road trains were disrupted by people cutting in between the trucks. I mean, it sounds like it doesn't sound like a hack, but that really is sort of a hack if it's causing those trucks to be unable to communicate with each other.
So I don't think that actually is causing them to not communicate. I think I know the story you're talking about, and this is about the story about convoying. Yeah. So the interest, the idea with convoying is that you have a bunch of long distance transport semis that are then driving, basically tailgating, but it's tailgating with computer control. And that allows them to ride in the slipstream of each other and get about a 15% fuel efficiency because they don't all need to break the wind independently.
And that's millions of dollars.
No,
right?
it's a ton of money.
Yeah.
Look, I actually think that autonomous trucks is probably one of the best places for this to happen, and the reason is that they're by and large traveling on highways. So there's a very restricted set of easy-going paths that they're going on, and then you can have, the equivalent of the harbor master that takes your truck in once you get into a populated area. But are some of the simplest roads. You get the biggest economic benefits. You have some labor issues because it is one of the last good blue-collar jobs is to be a truck driver. But that is a place where I expect shorter-term disruption because it makes so much sense for those companies and is less of a technical challenge, I think, than urban driving is.
Any thoughts there? Just so everyone knows, we have about 5 more minutes, so if there's any more questions to get in, please send them in. Let's see. What can we learn from the security incidents that have happened thus far with connected cars and autonomous cars? And by we, I mean, what should the public understand about them, and what is it that the car companies themselves have taken away?
So, aside from theft, I am not aware of any attacks in anger on connected cars, with this one exception in Texas that was kind of a special case with a disgruntled employee who disabled the fleet. But by and large,
he disabled the fleet?
So it was a fleet service, and they had equipped all of their cars with a thing so that they could reclaim their cars if they were stolen. And his parting gesture is he disabled all the cars. They weren't permanently bricked, but it was the moral equivalent of the guy at Twitter who turned off Donald Trump's account. It was his FU moment as he left the company. Ultimately, I think, went to jail. But so I am not aware of any attacks in anger. However, I will say that the companies, certainly between the recalls and the public attacks, have learned that they actually, that things like incident response are a thing that they need to have, that security is a post-sale issue. You can't think about it as a thing that just goes in the beginning, that there's been substantial investment in both changing how they do contracting, but then also technologies for doing testing and evaluation. I mean, a lot of it is actually bringing the automotive industry up to snuff with where normal desktop PC software was. And so a lot of that was applying those lessons back into the automotive space. The other thing is that they're gathering a lot more data. All right? And we haven't talked about this that much, but part of what all of these cars are going to end up having to do is monitor your car for anomalies. And all of them, certainly all the autonomous ones, are sending back everything about what you're doing because they're using that to come up with the data to improve how they work. So if you have a Tesla with autopilot, it is sending back every full thing that is going on in order to then go and kind of says, here's what I would have done here, and here's what we did do. And the end result of that is that, in fact, those are ways that we're going to improve. It also means that you now have to treat your car as something that is being pervasively monitored.
And Deirdre, this is a great question from the audience. Who owns that data, or who should own it?
So right now, if you look at Tesla, for example, all that data is going back to the manufacturer. Regulators have a hard time getting access to it, right? And you might think about the examination that the National Transportation Safety Board did of the Tesla crash. One of the things that they came out reporting is that there should be standards for the data that's being collected, about the vehicles, and that there should be standard ways for them to get access to it so they can do the sort of failure mode analysis that they need to do, and right now that doesn't happen. So for consumers, I don't know on all the cars how you can get access or what you can get access to, and I'd be interested from Stefan's perspective. My understanding of Tesla is that I don't get access to my own data, that data is going back, and I don't have access to it.
I think pervasively, all telematic systems, even outside of autonomous, the data that is being sent back, once you have opted into whatever contractual obligations are involved, it's not yours, right? That is data that is the company is maintaining and has ownership of, and for that matter, it is classic third-party doctrine data. So the government can subpoena it and say, "Tell me, I need to know where Deirdre was driving for the last 3 days. Please give that to me."
Now, the question about whether or not that should change and whether or not it could change and whether or not that's the same standard in other parts of the world, all different questions, right? And I think that when people think about their cars, I think, people sing in them, they do all sorts of things that people think, if we think about your home as your castle, I think many people think of their car as their castle on wheels. And so I think that there is an interest in having some greater control over that data where it reflects the behaviors of the human occupants. And some of the data that's being collected isn't necessarily things that I think people would assume was important for understanding events. Whether your radio was on, whether or not you had a phone that was active in the car, but those are the sorts of data that are important from the perspective of doing the crash analysis. And so I think that there's some tension. And when we think about privacy, right, it may be that you have access to the data for certain purposes, right, but the car manufacturers could be limited in how they use it, right, how they repurpose it, et cetera. And as a consumer, I might be able to get access to my data, and that, would still benefit my interests, even if I can't completely control it, right? That there may be multiple parties that have an interest in that information, including regulators.
I mean, if you can delete your web browser data, should you be able to delete your car data?
But this isn't the same thing as the web browser data. This is more the data of what searches you've sent to Google, because it is not in your car anymore. Right? You have sent this back, and it is being used for the purpose of improving. So it's like right now, I'll give you an analogy to a more banal but more familiar IoT device, like an Alexa or a Google Home. When you say Alexa or Google, that audio then gets sent over to that company, and it is stored there, and it is translated, and they send the stuff back, but it stays there, and they use it to then train natural language models going forward. But it is no longer on is not solely on your device. It is now in their cloud, and it is, only you have access to it to the extent that under contract they allow you to delete it.
And last question, how do you support the right to repair and aftermarket mods?
This is a really tricky one because I'm very ambivalent. All right? I am very ambivalent because the shutting people out from access, I think, has been used at times to enforce certain amounts of monopolistic control over their devices and limit the kinds of innovation that third parties can do. On the other hand, quite a lot of the third-party modification are things that in real life violate existing either environmental standards or safety standards or the warranty. And once you get into this kind of stuff where the car is actually making safety decisions, I don't think that we are going to be comfortable allowing people to tinker with their AI and say, I would like my car to be autonomous a little faster than my neighbor's car, which is what will happen absent some strong way of keeping that in check.
Yeah, I think, we have a long history of tinkering and modifying our vehicles. But the safety implications of some of those modifications, particularly when things are connected and they're supposed to be interacting together, and the sort of risk that that poses, we think about the externalities, right? And the externalities that are posed by you modifying something on your laptop are potentially very different than the externalities that are imposed on other people when you're modifying things that are safety critical or have environmental implications, right? And we think about those things differently, and there's good reason. So all modifications are not the same, I think is certainly one thing to think about. And we didn't actually talk about over-the-air updates, which is another...
That's another hour and a half.
Yeah, so...
All of your cars have them, whether or not they admit they have them. They all have them.
All right. Everybody, a round of applause, please, for Deirdre and Stefan. And thank you all for coming. And before we take off, Natalie from USENIX, I believe, has some words.
Thank you. Yeah, just very quickly, I'm Natalie Descharlet from USENIX Association. We are the people who put on these events as well as the full Enigma conference in January, which I encourage you to check out online and perhaps register. And we'd like to thank very much the speakers and the moderator for being here tonight, and also the sponsors who allow this to happen. We're a nonprofit, so we very much value their contributions. And we'd like to thank you all for coming and the people who have been live streaming. Thanks so much and have a wonderful evening.